Great. Well, thanks. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Nicole, for the invitation. Really happy to join the center today to talk about my dissertation project. And thank you, Francesco, for setting this up and organizing and exchanging a few emails about the process. Today, what I'm going to talk about is a part of my dissertation. I defended the project like at the end of November, so it's like an early stage. So I welcome any kind of comments about the topic, about the direction that this project is taking. I'm just really excited to share a bit the idea that I have at this point, and to engage, have a broader discussion about hope. So as I said, it's going to be a part of the dissertation. It was kind of an exercise for me to just sit down, find a case in this specific for this specific paper. It's the French Convention on Climate, and think a bit more about this notion of hope in politics. So what I want to do first is with this whole project. So the idea behind my dissertation is essentially to resist a bit the trivialization of hope, and to go beyond the simple idea as hope as a greeting card or as a political slogans. And instead, I want to argue for a greater engagement with hope as a political concept in democratic theory. And in my research, I focus a bit less on the more philosophical question about the nature of hope, and I want to bring a discussion more on its relationship with politics and democracy. So what I want to do essentially is think about how we can hope in a democratic setting. This kind of question, I think, shift the emphasis on from like the object of hope to the process, to the more imaginative and dynamic process that hopes requires from collectivity. So that's what really interests me with this specific topic. And the whole goal in the end is to theorize hope as a feature of democratic systems. So I was like a few words about the whole project. And we can talk in the Q&A more about where I'm going with the project, the structure of the session. I'll be happy to say more about that. So before beginning, a few words about the structure of my presentation today. First, I want to say a few words about this relationship between hope and democracy. It's a relationship that is often overlooked. So I think it would be great to have a little discussion about that. And then I want to talk about two dimensions of hope, the temporal and the spatial one, because hope involves both a projection toward the future, an orientation toward the future, but also a kind of critical reflection about where we are, about the ground on which we stand. So that's here the spatial dimension that I want to talk about. And then I want to draw a little bit on Hannah Arendt, who is kind of like the thinker behind my whole discussion on hope for the broader project. But on this specific manuscript, I'm talking mostly about her conception of promises to deal with uncertainty and in a way kind of like justified a kind of collective hope. And I will then use the example of the French Convention on Climate to talk a bit about the process behind this idea of promises, about hope, about the messiness of hope in politics. And then I will do a brief summary and then just say a few words about the next steps of my dissertation. So to begin with, democracy as an aspirational project has to be collectively nurtured. At the same time, democracy as a practice relies a bit on the idea that even if you lose something, even if you lose one fight in a way, there will be another chance. So for me, these two dimensions, I see here a clear connection with hope. And hope permeates the texture of our political life. It implies both. It implies a form of imagination and openness that speaks to many political practices, such as voting, deliberating, resisting, entering the public sphere, being part of a group, of a collectivity. So So it is part of how we actually live in a democratic society. But the challenge that we're facing now is there's this widening gap between this democratic ideal and the actual democratic practice. And this gap triggers a sense of the impression that democracy a bit, lacks kind of a common meaning, doesn't have any out of like purpose or orientation, is a bit like in the state of disrepair. And among all of that, there is this also this pervasive sense of powerlessness that comes in a way to limit our capacity to project ourselves in the future. There is this limitation of on our capacity to imagine what could be. And this brings attention when we talk about hope, when we talk about the politics of hope. Because hope is a regular part of our political life. As I said, we can think about different kind of examples of how hope is used, or how the language of hope is used in politics. But there is also a similar push. Every time there is a discussion about hope, there is also the counter argument that, well, what is actually hope? What are you talking about? It's a bit hope is seen as something that's essentially wishful thinking. It doesn't have any grounding, any meaning in politics. It's disconnected from the reality of politics itself. And this is also present when we look at the literature on hope in democratic theory in particularly. It is present because we don't really engage with the concept of hope. There is this whole idea that, well, if we look at democratic politics, notions like fear, like anger, cynicisms are way more apt to capture the reality of contemporary modern politics, while hope is seen as something a bit naive. So I want to push against that, and also argue that there is a political and democratic challenge here, in a way that the lack of conceptual clarity around hope brings a challenge in the fact that, well, then hope can be used in different kind of ways, and we see that as hope is sometimes used by a political leader and instrumentalized in different kind of ways to achieve different kind of purposes. So we can talk more about the challenges here later. But the goal here is not necessarily to defend hope as a concept. I still think that there is some form of hope that are not really productive for democracy. Hope can of course induce a kind of state of like idleness. It can bring this idea that everything's going to be all right, so why should I bother getting engaged? But there are forms of hope that I think are important to think about when we think about democratic action and democracy. And that's where I want to go, to have a more, let's say, a more nuanced discussion about the role and the meaning of hope in democracy. So as I said, there are many different kinds of modes of hope, and they all play different kind of roles in our political life. We see it in different ways. Hope can be located either like in the self. It could be it can be embodied in someone or something that is external to a community, or it could be part of an actual group of people. Like it can emerge between in the middle of the interaction between people. So what I want to say with that is that hope is then this thing that can sustain our action in the face of dire odds. So hope is here, and that's a big part of the literature in political philosophy and psychology mostly, and even a bit on in anthropology. There's this clear link between hope and agency. So hope doesn't require that you expect that something specific will eventually happen. That doesn't expect you to think that your hopeful idea or hopeful end will actually be achieved. But but all hope requires is this idea that, well, it is possible. And at a collective level, the sense of possibility in democratic politics is important. And what I want to argue here is that when we think about the role of hope and the language of hope in democratic politics, what we see essentially is that it is not used in a way to bring back hope in hopeless individuals, but the language of hope in politics is used to highlight the fact that hope is actually absent in how we orient ourselves collectively toward the future. So there is a gap in politics when we think about where we could go, how we can imagine what could be. And the language of hope, the politics of hope, tend to like mitigate this gap in a way. And that, I think, is the political problem of hope. It's not less the objectives that are put forward than what it requires from the collectivity. Hence the question of how can we hope collectively? And on that point, there is this notion interesting from Gas and Hans, this idea of co-hoping. That is, I think that speaks to this notion of hope in politics, of how can we eventually essentially hope, how can it's imagining one's hope with others. So it is not only what do you hope for as an individual, but what is the process that actually brings you to exchange, talk with others, and help understand what we can think about, what we can imagine, what could be. And this brings both the temporal and spatial dimension of hope. So let's see, I'm going to say a few words about both dimensions. Let's begin with the temporal one, because I think it's the most common one when we think about hope, this projection toward the future. It's an important dimension because we can understand that political hope is evolved in this kind of universe of uncertainty in politics. Politics is unpredictable, is uncertain. We never know what's going to happen. Bonnie Hunting talked about, that politics is always a constant settling and unsettling. And there is, in reaction to this uncertainty, this creation of an anticipatory state of fear and anxiety. And that is often where we tend to focus our attention in political science, political theory, and in thematic theory, how to mitigate the fear and anxiety that is triggered by the uncertainty of politics. But what is interesting, though, is that when we look in the literature, in philosophy, in psychology, there's a clear link between hope and uncertainty too. So hope is also considered as an anticipatory state created in reaction to uncertain event. So in a sense, hope and fear are not opposite phenomenon, but interrelated in how they react to uncertain situation. So the claim I want to make here is a bit building on what Mark Warren talked in one of his papers, is essentially that democracy can mitigate the anxiety of politics by holding open different kind of spaces, right? That will essentially create new forms of security. But that doesn't only mitigate fear, but can also harness hope. And that's, I think, an important point of this reflection. The other one, when we think about the future as a collectivity, is that we need also trust, because hope requires, in a way, kind of like make you realize that you can't achieve something by yourself. So you need the help of others. There is this recognition of your own limit as an agent when we think about hope. So here, the role of trust in how we approach uncertain event in the future is also important. And I'm going to talk more about that when we're going to discuss this idea of promises in the case of the French Convention. So, but this spatial dimension of hope is not isolated from where we stand in the present. So there is this clear interconnection between the temporal and spatial dimension of hope. So here, what I want to say about the spatial dimension of hope is essentially that the space where we stand are important in providing a kind of security that help us imagine what could be. It is the spaces that link people together, that bring them as a collective, that are able essentially to think where they could go. But we're seeing a challenge here again with the erosion and fragmentation of those kind of spaces in contemporary politics. But what is interesting is that in response to this contestation of modern politics, we also have this alternative trend, that is this idea of reimagining the organization of democratic societies. So there is here this idea of thematic renewal. We can see that with the creation of new spaces, like deliberative minipublics, but not only deliberative minipublics. We can see that with the action of everyday actors. So there is something in how we think about the organization of democratic societies that is based on this kind of like spatial understanding of where we are, that also link us back to the temporal dimension of hope, of imagining where we could go and what could be. So I think here we have these two interaction between the spatial and temporal dimension of hope that are important in how we actually use or think about hope in contemporary politics. So these spaces that actually bring us together and create this kind of sense of these collectivities are generating, can generate a form of collective hope. But these spaces are multiple. There are various kinds. Some are more spontaneous, some are more organized. So hope that can emerge from them can also be quite different and different. So the whole challenge that this multiplication of group hopes or collective hopes in a democratic society is that we also need a kind of framework to be able to filter out some of those collective hopes and have a kind of understanding of, well, what kind of hope can we consider as more democratic than other? And here I think that this idea of relying on deliberative democracy as a framework to actually build those collective hope provide an interesting and productive avenue for the relationship between hope and democracy. So here the whole idea is essentially that deliberative democracy as a framework is able to substantiate a more collective intersubjective form of hope that differs from individual expression of hope, but also from different kind of competing collective hope in a sense. So it can empower, filter out some group hopes, can create shared meanings. And under this framework, this deliberative democracy framework, we can think of hope as both a site of contestation and of transformation. And on this, the idea of deliberative minipublics can provide an example of how we can think about a space that actually bring some people together and have those kind of and have this debative process in which there is this transformation where everybody's individual hope can actually take a new meaning, get a new shape, a new form, and create this more collective orientation. So, so what is important then, though, is going back to this notion of space and of uncertainty in politics, is this idea that the spaces that bring some people together need to be in a way kind of like secure. You need to have a ground where you can stand, where you can, where you're able to actually project yourself in the future. So Hannah Arendt has a great discussion in The Human Condition about the faculty to make and keep promises as being what actually keep communities together. And these promises are essentially what mitigate for her the unpredictability of political action. And these promises are necessary to actually create new possibilities, and they are creating island of, and she called that the island of certainty in an ocean of uncertainty. So minipublics, in a sense, represent a bit this idea of bringing people together under a set of specific criteria, where we can have this secure environment where we can generate a kind of new idea that can open then new form of possibilities. So yeah, I got lost in this thing. The challenge, though, is when we think about going back to minipublic, the challenge that we're facing is that these spaces are often created on an kind of like external promise of consequentiality. So there is this whole idea that the space is created by some kind of political elite that will create that will create the event, the initiative, and will promise that the consideration recommendation of the mini public will actually be able to be heard. We can actually change things and move forward. So there is here, so like without a kind of a clear framework or status, this promise, this external promise, justifies the hope that something might actually come out of this process. And with this, I'm going to move to the example to just illustrate a bit more clearly this idea. So I choose the French Convention on Climate because it is, in my sense, a more political mini-public than other similar iterations like the Climate Assembly UK. The French Convention on Climate, you're probably familiar with the initiative. We can discuss a bit more about that in the Q&A. But what is really interesting with this process is that the French president made a promise at 3 occasions, this promise that is often called as the without filters. And this whole idea was that the recommendation of the convention will be sent without any kind of filters by the president directly to parliamentarians for a vote, or they will be sent to the public under like a kind of referendum, or they will be translated into executive orders. But and this promise was made at 3 occasions: when the president created the convention at the end of April 2019, was made when the president met with the participants of the convention in January 2020, and at the end of the deliberative process when he actually received the recommendations. But since then, there is a clear gap between the recommendation of the convention of the CCC and the bill, the proposal that the government put forward. And this is, I think, a really interesting story when we think about the French Convention. So what I did essentially, I went and I kind of like and I observed like 2 different moments of the French Convention. The first one was a meeting in mid-December. So after the end of the convention, between the French president, 7 of his ministers, and 125 participants of the convention, they had this meeting to discuss the kind of polemic around this idea of the without filters. There was a big debate in the public public space around the promise made by the president. There was some idea that he wasn't actually respecting his initial promise to the convention, and they had this three more hours meeting to discuss. It was a public meeting. They discussed all kinds of stuff. The members were pushing back against the president, and the last moment that I observed was the last meeting of the convention that was held at the end of February, where the participants were reflecting about the whole process, both about the influence of the French Convention and the value of this kind of process for democracy. And what is really interesting is that in both occasions, you can see the change in how people talked about this external promise, the without filters made by Macron. There was first a kind of like, they all recognized that there was this initial skepticism. Well, he's a politician, he's making a promise, but he will never actually respect the promise. But over the course of the convention, they kind of start to hope that, well, maybe there's something else. Maybe he's going to do it. So, and at the end, there was a clear frustration among the participants. So what is really interesting with this promise, the initial promise made by the president kind of like empowered the convention at first, elevated status in politics, but then there was this clear kind of like push back by the convention when they felt that the president was not respecting this promise. And we can see that in some of like the remarks made by the participants, that they felt that they have been duped, betrayed, this feeling of frustration, dread, sadness. All those expressions, all those feelings, emotions were mentioned when they talked about the president and his promise of the without filters. But having those kind of external promises that are made, that are kept by someone who's not part of the group, of the collectivity, is inherently complicated, because the group itself has little control about what's going to happen in the end. And if we go back to Arendt and her discussion about promises, the binding power of the promise is essentially its capacity to maintain the space of certainty, in a sense. But by backtracking on this promise, there was a clear break by the president. But what is interesting here is the fact that even if this promise was not fulfilled, there is something else that happened during the process that kind of like substantiate the promise made by the president. And what I want to say here is there is this clear shift during the process, the deliberative process, the clear shift of hope from a promise made by a promise that was external to the collectivity, external to the group, to essentially something that becomes part of themselves, part of the French Convention. So over the course of the deliberation, the course of the nine months of deliberation, the participants end up binding themselves with some kind of mutual promises. All this idea essentially of promising the promises to hear one another, to listen one another, to respect one another, to work collectively, to establish those kind of like recommendation to actually put forward a robust set of recommendation to fight the climate crisis. All these promises that the participants made to one another kept them together. So when the external promise, in a way, when the president backtracked on this initial promise, instead of having a kind of, well, it is what it is, let's just go back home, you can see that their hope of the convention moved elsewhere. It was not embodied in Macron, it was represented by the whole work of the convention, by the whole process, by the report they put forward. And we can see that in this quote from one of the members that essentially says that, well, the convention, we believed in it, but what is important for us as member of the convention is the report that we put forward. And that's what I believe in. And it's really interesting because this shift of hope from the president to actually the whole deliberative process create a new kind of possibilities. It empowered the participants as political agents. It created a sense of collective ownership around like the report, about where they're going, and it's also based on this idea that their work was actually resonating outside the boundaries of the mini public. And for instance, there was the day that they submitted the bill to the National Assembly, there was a big protest, a big mobilization in France, in many cities, that was organized in part by people affiliated with the climate, with the Citizen Convention on Climate, and a series of other kind of organizations. There was a large mobilization, something like, they claimed something 100,000 people were actually protesting in the street, asking for a real climate law that was actually based on the recommendation of the French Convention. So there is here an interesting thing, that the hope that was created by the convention, that was initially embodied by Macron, and his capacity to actually make legislative changes in France, in the response of how France talk about the climate crisis. Well, this hope was actually changed within a move from something external to a group to something that is essentially part of who they are. And that has this kind of like broader resonance outside the boundaries of the public. So essentially what I want to say here is that the practice of hope essentially is messy. It is located in various spaces. It's not fixed. But what is really interesting is that hope essentially, when we think about hope in its relationship with democracy, is to try to understand, to unpack the imaginative and dynamic process that hope requires from a collectivity, rather than focus on the object itself. So the idea is not just in this specific case to achieve a set of specific policies with Macron, but there was within the course of the deliberative process, there was a shift, and the shift created a more broader, let's say, impact in how we think about politics around climate change, and empowered some people. Some of them are running for offices. Some of them are going back in different kind of organizations. They created their own association to continue pushing for the recommendation. So there is something interesting to think about the process of hope and what it actually requires from a group. And deliberative mini-publics constitute, I think, a good example, not the only one. I'm not claiming that there's only citizen assemblies that can create hope, but a good example of actually a space that can facilitate this idea of co-hoping, that can create new possibilities, that can provide a stable framework in which people can have those kind of interactions, this kind of deliberative process. So it is essentially a mode of hope that is shaped and transformed by the members of a group. And then, as I said, like, the mini-publics shouldn't be idealized as the sole or main idea of how we can have this collective hope and the co-hoping. There's many challenges in how we think about, and I think, and the main one is this idea of how do we sustain these hope that emerge from this kind of processes beyond their boundaries. So the next step essentially is to think about two elements. The first one is on hope, which kind of is the first part of my dissertation, and this is essentially to develop a theoretical framework that I want to base on Hannah Arendt's political thought. So using her thoughts around power, around natality, political action, to actually develop this collective notion of hope. And then regarding democracy, what's interesting is moving out of the spaces created by mini-publics, other stuff, is to think about its relationship with political practices, but also how it can be embedded in a democratic system. So bring a more systemic lenses when we think about hope and democracy. So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward for discussing this topic.